At 6 minutes past 6 o'clock on the morning of the 20th of November, 1910, the station clock at Astapovo was stopped by hand. Someone reached up and froze the hands in place, as if time itself needed to be told what had just happened. In the narrow bedroom of a railway station master's wooden house, on a cot barely wide enough to hold him, the most famous writer in the world had just died. There were no icons above his head. He had been excommunicated from the Russian Orthodox Church 9 years earlier. Outside, in the cold, reporters from a dozen countries pressed against the walls. Police agents watched from the platform, and somewhere on that same platform, separated from her husband by a closed window and the will of men who despised her, Sophia Tolstoy stood and wept. She had been his wife for 48 years. She had copied out his manuscripts by hand, War and Peace Alone, 7 times over, and borne him 13 children, and they had not let her in. How does a man who gave the world its most celebrated meditation on family, on love, on what it means to live and die with meaning, how does he end up dying alone, in a stranger's room, in a place no one had ever heard of, while his wife stood outside in the freezing dark, not permitted to say goodbye? His name was Count Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy, and what you are about to hear is not a story about a great writer. It is a story about what greatness costs the people who share a name with it. In the next 40 minutes, you will discover the secret will that Tolstoy signed on a tree stump in the forest of Yasnaya Polyana in 1909, a document that divided his descendants across 3 continents. You will learn about the prophetic letter he wrote about his daughter Maria before she was 2 years old, in which he predicted, word for word, how her life would end. And you will follow the Tolstoy bloodline as it scattered across Russia, America, Sweden, Morocco, and Italy, each branch carrying something broken from the source. What you are about to hear is not a story about genius. It is a story about inheritance. Stay with it. He was born on the 28th of August, 1828, in a country estate called Yasnaya Polyana. The name translates, with a certain irony, as Clear Glade, located about 200 kilometers south of Moscow in the Tula province. The estate covered thousands of acres. It had forests and orchards, a pond that froze in winter and bloomed with insects in summer, and a main house surrounded by birch trees that made a sound like distant rain when the wind moved through them. 300 serfs worked the land. They were not paid. This was the world into which Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy was born, gilded, vast, and built entirely on the labor of human beings treated as property. His mother, Princess Maria Volkonskaya, died when he was 2 years old, so early that he had no memory of her face, only of a warmth he associated with her, and spent his entire life trying to describe. His father, Count Nikolai Ilyich Tolstoy, a veteran of the war against Napoleon, died when Leo was 9. By the time he was 10, Leo Tolstoy had been passed from guardian to guardian, relative to relative, an aunt here, another aunt there, and every home he entered was someone else's. This is where the pattern begins. Not with malice, 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 not with malice. He was perhaps 5 or 6 years old. His older brother Nikolai, the eldest of the 4 Tolstoy boys, gathered the younger siblings and told them that he had written on a green stick, buried somewhere in the edge of the Yasnaya Polyana forest, the secret to human happiness. If they could find it, suffering would end. All of it, not just theirs but everyone's. The brothers searched for the stick, earnestly, the way children search for hidden things they half believe exist. They did not find it, but Leo never forgot it. He spent the next 80 years looking for it, in military campaigns, in gambling halls, in the arms of peasant women, in marriage, in religion, in philosophy, in renunciation, in flight, and he never found it either. He asked, late in life, to be buried near the spot where Nikolai had said the stick was hidden. He had kept that request in mind for 70 years. The childhood that followed was unsettled in the way that produces either broken people or relentless seekers. Leo was both. Teachers at Kazan University, where he enrolled to study law at 16, described him in records that still exist as both unable and unwilling to learn. He dropped out without a degree. He accumulated gambling debts so severe that he eventually lost the main house of Yasnaya Polyana in a card game, the house he was born in, dismantled and carted away piece by piece. He chased women, he drank, he joined the army to escape the debts, and he began to write. The green stick was still out there. He was certain of it. Forward now, 17 years, and a different kind of search beginning. On the 23rd of September, 1862, Leo Tolstoy married Sophia Andreevna Bears in a ceremony in Moscow. He was 34 years old. She was 18. He had handed her, the night before their wedding, his diaries, years of them, detailing every sexual encounter, every serf woman, the illegitimate son born on his estate, the violence of his appetites. He wanted her to know everything before she said yes. She read them through the night and married him anyway. This tells you almost everything you need to know about both of them. They moved to Yasnaya Polyana. The house Leo had lost in the card game was gone, but a smaller structure remained, and it was here that Sophia set about constructing a life for a man whose genius would require an extraordinary amount of practical maintenance. She became his copyist, his editor, his financial manager, his postmistress, and simultaneously the mother of 13 children across 26 years of marriage. She copied War and Peace 7 times by hand, deciphering his cramped, heavily revised manuscript drafts and producing legible versions for the publisher. 7 times. The manuscript ran to over 500,000 words. During those early years, the house was full. Guests came constantly: writers, musicians, artists, philosophers, peasants who had walked for days to speak with Tolstoy. Anton Chekhov visited. Ivan Turgenev visited. Ilya Repin came to paint portraits. Thomas Edison sent a phonograph as a gift, and the family recorded Leo's voice on it, a recording that survives. The library at Yasnaya Polyana grew to nearly 10,500 volumes in 27 languages. Tolstoy taught himself 13 languages, including Hebrew and Ancient Greek and Arabic, because he wanted to read texts in their original form and trust no intermediary. He had, during these years, everything: the acres of birch forest, the children thundering through the rooms, the work that was making him immortal. He had Sophia, who was by any measure one of the most industrious and gifted partners any writer has ever had, and who loved him with a ferocity that would eventually become its own kind of catastrophe. Everything, everything. But the diaries were already recording something else. As early as 1880, the same year his youngest surviving daughter Alexandra was born. 3 years before her birth, actually, in 1877, Tolstoy had entered what he later called his spiritual crisis. He had finished Anna Karenina. He had hidden the guns and ropes at Yasnaya Polyana because he did not trust himself around them. He had written in his private notebooks that he could not understand why he should not simply kill himself. He had, in other words, reached the peak of his public life at the precise moment that his inner world was coming apart. Within a decade, the marriage would fracture in ways that would not be repaired. I told you about the secret will signed on a tree stump. I will return to it. Before we go any further, you need to understand one thing about Leo Tolstoy. He was not simply a writer who happened to have religious beliefs. In the 1880s, something broke open in him, or broke through, and the man who emerged from that rupture was not recognizable as the same person who had written War and Peace. He began to believe, with a force that could not be argued away, that wealth was a moral obscenity, that the church was a lie, that marriage, as an institution built on property and biological possession, was incompatible with the Christian ideal of love, that he personally was damned by the comfort in which he lived. He began dressing as a peasant. He made his own boots. He ploughed fields alongside the serfs, literally, alongside people whose grandparents had been owned by his grandparents. He gave up meat, he gave up alcohol, he gave up sex, or attempted to. He began writing religious and philosophical essays that were immediately banned by the Tsarist censors and circulated underground. And he began to attract followers, devotees who called themselves Tolstoyans, who came to Yasnaya Polyana and stayed for weeks or months, living on the estate, eating the food Sophia provided, sleeping in rooms she maintained, and reinforcing at every turn the idea that Tolstoy's wife was the obstacle between the great man and his spiritual purity. What Sophia's diary recorded during this period, and her diary runs to thousands of pages, many still not fully translated or published in English, was the experience of watching her husband dismantle everything they had built together and declare it sinful. He wanted to give away the copyrights to all his works, including the ones that were feeding their children. She refused. He capitulated. Partially. She could keep the rights to everything published before 1881. Everything after that went to Vladimir Chertkov. Chertkov was 39 years old when he first met Tolstoy in 1883. He was an aristocrat, former officer of the Guards, and he had, in Tolstoy's estimation, the purest understanding of the Tolstoyan gospel of anyone alive. Tolstoy wrote to him with love. More than 2,000 letters survive between them. Chertkov gained editorial control of Tolstoy's new writings, access to his private diaries, and eventually, through mechanisms that remain disputed, the role of sole executor of Tolstoy's literary estate. What Sophia did not know, for years, was the extent of Chertkov's control, and what the children did not know was that the man their father had placed above the family's financial survival bore a name whose root, in Russian, was the word for devil. Chert, devil. The Russian is precise. Now pay attention to what I am about to tell you, because this is the detail that every biography underweights, and it is the one that explains everything that comes after. In January of 1895, Leo Tolstoy's youngest son, Ivan, died. He was 6 years old. The cause was scarlet fever. His full name was Ivan Lvovich Tolstoy. He was called Vanya. What the official accounts do not fully convey is the manner in which Vanya had come to exist in the family's life. He was born in 1888, when Sophia was 44 years old, and had spent 26 years producing children who would spend their lives in the shadow of a father they could neither equal nor escape. Sophia, by her own account, did not want more children by that point. Doctors had warned against it after several previous births. Tolstoy was 60 years old and still insisting on his conjugal rights while simultaneously writing, that same year, a novella called the Kreutzer Sonata, whose narrator murders his wife in a jealous rage, and whose thinly described victims bore a disturbing resemblance to Sophia. The novella was published the year Vanya was born. But Vanya himself was different from the others. He was luminous in the way that makes people uneasy, too bright, too warm, too present. Sophia wrote that he brought a quality of love into the house that had not existed before. Tolstoy, who was not generally tender with his children, was tender with Vanya. There is a photograph from 1892 of Tolstoy telling a story to his grandchildren, with Vanya visible at the edge of the frame, watching his father with an expression of complete attention. A year before his death, Vanya asks Sophia whether his dead brother Alexei, who had died of stomach trouble at age 5 in 1886, had become an angel. She said people believed so. Vanya then told her, with the gravity of a child who understands more than is possible, that it would be better if he too died before the age of 7, so that he could become an angel. He was not yet 6. He would be dead before his 7th birthday. You, watching this now, consider what it means to receive that statement from a child, and then watch it come true. Tolstoy's daughter Maria wrote that the loss of Vanya was the defining catastrophe of her mother's life, not the failed marriage, not the exile at the end, but this. Sophia never recovered from it in any complete sense, and there is a detail about the months that followed that no biographer has ever fully explained. In the year after Vanya's death, Sophia began keeping a new notebook, separate from her main diary, in which she wrote only about Vanya. That notebook was never published. Here is what I need you to hold on to. The death of Vanya in January of 1895 was not only a family tragedy, it was the crack through which everything else got in. What happened to the marriage in the 15 years that followed? In the years after Vanya's death, the household at Yasnaya Polyana fractured along a line that was invisible to almost everyone outside it. Publicly, Leo Tolstoy was at the height of his global reputation. Foreign journalists made pilgrimages to interview him. The Nobel Prize Committee nominated him for the Literature Prize every year from 1902 through 1906. Gandhi was corresponding with him from South Africa. The Tsarist secret police maintained surveillance on him, fearing that his influence over the peasantry was politically destabilizing. He was, by any external measure, the most famous man in Russia and one of the most famous men in the world. Privately, his wife lay awake counting the footsteps of Chertkov's disciples as they moved through the house she ran. She wrote in her diary, entries that have only been partially published and whose most raw passages remain difficult to access in English, that she felt she was living in her own home as a servant among ideologues who despised her. I am afraid I cannot resist complaining about Lev Nikolaevich whenever I write my diary, she wrote in 1895. This was one of the more measured sentences. Other entries describe running into the garden at night, threatening to drown herself in the pond. One describes placing a bottle of opium on her dressing table and calculating the dose. Here is the part that no biography has ever fully explained. Sophia was not simply a hysterical aristocrat, struggling to accept her husband's conversion. The record now available, including the biography by Alexandra Popov, Sophia Tolstoy, published in 2010, which draws on previously unavailable documents, shows that Chertkov was conducting what the Tolstoyan secretary later described as a deliberate campaign for the moral destruction of Sophia Tolstoy, specifically to gain unchallenged control of Tolstoy's manuscripts and future literary estate. He circulated information from Tolstoy's private diaries among the disciples. He excluded Sophia from conversations with her own husband. He stationed followers in the house who reported on her behavior. And he had an ally in several of the Tolstoy sons. The same sons who, unlike the daughters, had received from their father neither spiritual mentorship nor professional direction, and who now found themselves middle-aged men without stable careers, dependent on the income from their father's copyrights, which their father was in the process of giving away. The children were already paying. Andrei, the seventh child, born in 1877, had fought in the Russo-Japanese War and won a military decoration. He had also run off with his wife and begun a second family. He drank. He had no particular gifts that anyone had bothered to develop. He was his mother's favorite and his father's disappointment. Lev, the third son, born in 1869, had been at odds with his father since adolescence. After leaving his pregnant wife in 1909, he would eventually emigrate to Sweden, remarry, and spend his remaining years living with his adult children or his sister Tatiana, a man who had drifted loose from everything. The pattern was becoming visible, not yet named. In the autumn of 1906, Tolstoy's second daughter, Maria, known to the family as Masha, died of pneumonia at Yasnaya Polyana. She was 35 years old. She died, as one family account put it, practically in her father's arms. This was not the first time Tolstoy had watched death take someone he loved while he was close enough to touch them. But it was different in one specific way. Masha had been the one child, out of all 13, with whom Leo Tolstoy had allowed himself the complete expression of tenderness. She was the one who had followed him into the fields to scythe grain, the one who had nursed peasants through illness, the one who had shared his vegetarianism, his spiritual convictions, his rejection of social comfort. He had written about her in a letter to his aunt when she was 2 years old, describing her as weak and sickly, with white curly hair and big blue eyes, very intelligent, but plain. She will be one of the riddles. She will suffer. She will seek and find nothing, will always be seeking what is least attainable. He had written that letter in 1873. He had described her fate before she had lived it. Masha married a prince named Nikolai Obolensky, who was, as one family account puts it, with almost comic precision, totally penniless. He loved her, and that was most of what he had to offer. They were unable to have children that survived. Masha experienced multiple stillbirths. Her mother Sophia believed this was due to Masha's strict vegetarianism, the physical labor she refused to give up, and the general asceticism she had absorbed from her father. Masha continued to work alongside peasants regardless. Then pneumonia. The public response was sympathetic in the distant way that famous people's tragedies are sympathetic. The private response, as recorded in Tolstoy's own diary, was volcanic. He wrote of a grief he could not organize into language. He was 78 years old. He had outlived 2 sons who died in infancy, a son who died at 5, a son who died at 7, and now the daughter who was closest to him had gone before him. He made a decision in the months after Masha's death that anyone observing the pattern could identify as a mistake, though not in the terms his admirers used. He drew Chertkov closer. He began meeting with him more frequently, dictating to him, allowing him to become the repository of his private thoughts, in a way that had formerly been Sophia's function. And sometime in 1909, deep in the birch forest at Yasnaya Polyana, he sat down on a tree stump and signed a document. "I told you about that tree stump. It is time to return to it. The secret will existed. This is established fact." Tolstoy signed it in the Yasnaya Polyana forest in the summer of 1909. The document, drafted and refined by Chertkov over a period of years, designated Chertkov as executor of Tolstoy's literary estate and gave him control over all of Tolstoy's post-1881 writings, the novels, the essays, the philosophical tracts, the letters, the diaries. Tolstoy's youngest daughter, Alexandra, was named co-executor, but she was in her 20s and the practical power resided with Chertkov. When Sophia found out, and she found out through the kind of obsessive household surveillance that had by now become her primary activity, the consequences were immediate. She described in her diary marching into Tolstoy's study in September of 1910 with a child's toy pistol, shooting a photograph of Chertkov that hung on the wall, tearing the photograph into pieces and flushing it down the toilet. When Tolstoy walked in, she fired the pistol again to frighten him. She wrote, "I shall kill Chertkov. I'll have him poisoned. It is either him or me." The press, which had been watching the Tolstoy household with increasing fascination, began to receive reports of the chaos inside. Correspondents stationed near Yasnaya Polyana sent dispatches about the household's daily dramas. A contemporary account described the walls of the house shaking at night, with the sound of shouting and weeping. Here is what the press was reporting as the scandal: an old man and his hysterical wife fighting over a will. Here is what the press was not reporting: that Sophia's suspicion was entirely correct. That Chertkov had spent 3 decades carefully positioning himself to inherit control of the most valuable literary estate in Russia. That Tolstoy's own sons, who sided with Sophia in the dispute, not out of love for their mother, but out of financial self-interest, had privately told Sophia they would challenge the will's validity on grounds of Tolstoy's diminished mental capacity, and that Alexandra Popov's biography, published a full century later, would draw on documents not available to earlier scholars to demonstrate that Chertkov's influence over Tolstoy in these final years was, in her documented assessment, tremendous and despotic. What the press was mocking as a domestic embarrassment was, in fact, a legal and cultural seizure in progress. But the real secret, the one that remained hidden not for years but for generations, was in Sophia's diary. Not all of it has been published, not all of it has been translated, and one entry from 1910 records that she had consulted a medical reference to understand the effects of opium poisoning. The entry continues: first excitement, then lethargy, no antidote. She never used it, but she had researched it. The callback to the hidden life of Section 4 arrives here. What the scandal appeared to be was a woman losing control. What it actually was a woman who had been systematically maneuvered out of her own life. At 3 o'clock in the morning, on the 28th of October, 1910, Tolstoy woke to the sound of Sophia moving through his study. She was searching his desk drawers. He lay still and listened. Then he rose, picked up an electric flashlight, a small, modern thing in an otherwise ancient life, and made a decision that he had been rehearsing in various forms for 30 years. He dressed. He walked out of the house at Yasnaya Polyana, into the dark and the cold. He was 82 years old. His personal physician, Dr. Dushan Makovitsky, was awakened and told only that they were leaving. He asked no questions. Tolstoy's daughter Alexandra was also told. She joined them. They took almost nothing. In a letter left for Sophia, Tolstoy wrote that he was doing what old men of his age were wont to do, seeking solitude, seeking silence, seeking a death he could control. He asked her not to search for him. He did not know where he was going. This was documented by Makovitsky. Tolstoy himself did not know his destination. He gave instructions one train at a time, as if each choice could only be made by cancelling all the ones before it. They travelled for 26 hours. They went first to the nearby town of Tula, then to a monastery at Optina, where Tolstoy did not go inside. He had been excommunicated for 9 years and would not compromise the gesture now. then to a convent at Shamordino, where his sister Maria lived as a nun. He stayed 2 days with Maria. He told her he might go to Bulgaria. He told Sasha he might go further still. But he had caught a cold on the train. The cold deepened. By the 31st of October, on a train moving southward through the flat Russian countryside, Makovitsky realized the chill had become something worse. At Astapovo station, a mid-sized provincial railway stop in what is now the Lipetsk region, 250 miles southeast of Moscow, the doctor got Tolstoy off the train. The station master, a man named Ivan Ozolin, gave them the main room of his house, the best he had. From those rooms, as Tolstoy's fever climbed, telegrams went out to the world. Russia's first mass media death watch had begun. Sophia received the telegram at Yasnaya Polyana. She arrived at Astapovo by private train, and there she was told, by Chertkov and the disciples who now surrounded the station master's house, that her presence agitated Tolstoy and that she should not enter. She stood on the platform. She peered through the window of the room where her husband lay. Someone photographed her doing it. Here is the first of the 3 original teasers paid off. The secret will signed on a tree stump in the birch forest, the one Sophia had been searching his desk to find, had done its work. Even dying, Tolstoy was not hers. Vladimir Grigorievich Chertkov was born on the 3rd of November, 1854, in St. Petersburg, to one of the most connected aristocratic families in Russia. His mother was a celebrated beauty who moved in the innermost circles of imperial society. His father was a general adjutant under 2 czars. His childhood friend would grow up to be Dmitry Trepov, the same Dmitry Trepov who would later organize the organized violence against Jewish communities in Russia and order soldiers to fire on student demonstrators. Chertkov called him a decent man. He came to see Tolstoy in October of 1883, when he was 29 years old and Tolstoy was 55. He had not read Tolstoy's novels. He came for the religion. Tolstoy, who was in the early years of his spiritual transformation, received him. What followed was a relationship that Tolstoy described as the most essential of his life, and which his personal doctor would later characterize as tremendous and despotic. Over the course of 27 years, Chertkov became Tolstoy's publisher, his editor, his secretary, his conscience, and his executor. He gained control of Tolstoy's diaries. He circulated their contents. He established a publishing house, operating first in England, where he had been exiled by the Tsar for his Tolstoyan agitation, and used it to distribute Tolstoy's banned religious writings across Europe. He accumulated more than 2,000 letters from Tolstoy, making him the writer's largest correspondent by a vast margin. His handwriting was later identified by researchers on at least one report to the Petersburg police, raising questions about his relationship to the surveillance apparatus that monitored Tolstoy for 5 decades. Alexandra Popov's documented analysis describes his character as possessing the traits of what we would now recognize as a psychopathic manipulator. Exaggerated self-worth, emotional shallowness, an unmatched capacity to make everyone around him into an instrument or an enemy. What Chertkov gave Tolstoy was unconditional ideological validation. In the years when Tolstoy's family resisted his demand to give everything away, Chertkov agreed with every impulse. He reflected Tolstoy's most extreme beliefs back at him, polished and confirmed. Tolstoy, who had been arguing with Sophia for 20 years about the copyright question, found in Chertkov a man who simply said, "Yes, you are right, they are wrong." What Chertkov cost Tolstoy was the last decade of his marriage and the coherence of his family. What he cost the children was harder to calculate. He inherited the literary estate. He suppressed Sophia's account of the marriage. He guided the official narrative of Tolstoy's spiritual development. He lived until 1936, outlasting Sophia by 17 years, and continued to position himself as the guardian of Tolstoy's authentic legacy long after everyone who could contradict him was dead. He never apologized for keeping Sophia from the bedside. In his own account of the final days, she was the villain. 13 children, 5 did not survive childhood. The remaining 8 lived into the 20th century, and their lives constitute one of the most starkly documented case studies in the generational cost of genius. Sergei, the eldest, born in 1863, became a professor of music at the Moscow Conservatory and a respected ethnomusicologist. He stayed in Russia after the revolution and died in Moscow in 1947 at the age of 84. He wrote memoirs about his father. He was the most stable of them. Tatiana, born in 1864, trained as a painter and created around 30 portraits of her father. She became the first director of the Yasnaya Polyana Museum after Tolstoy's death. In 1925, after years of starving in the post-revolutionary chaos, she left Russia for Paris, then Rome. She spent the rest of her long life in exile and died in Rome in 1950 at the age of 85. Ilya, born in 1866, the one Tolstoy considered most gifted in literature, failed to finish school, drifted through several careers, emigrated to America in 1918, and lectured on his father's work to pay his bills. He died of cancer in New York in 1933 at the age of 67. Lev, born in 1869, never resolved his quarrel with his father, abandoned his pregnant wife in 1909, emigrated to Sweden, remarried, had 12 children, and died there in 1945. Maria, born in 1871, the prophesied one, the one Tolstoy had predicted would seek and find nothing, died at 35 in 1906. She never had a surviving child. Andrei, born in 1877, fought in 2 wars, ran off with another man's wife, held a minor government position, and died of blood poisoning in Petrograd in 1916 at the age of 38. Mikhail, born in 1879, served in the First World War, emigrated after the revolution, and died in Morocco in 1944 at 65. He had 9 children. Alexandra, born in 1884. Sasha, the youngest daughter, the one Tolstoy trusted most, was arrested 5 times by the Soviet government, spent a year in prison for supporting free speech, eventually received permission to leave in 1929, lectured in Japan, and settled in America, where she founded the Tolstoy Foundation in 1939 and spent the rest of her 95 years helping refugees escape Soviet persecution. She died in New York in 1979. Here is the second of the 3 original teasers paid off. The letter Tolstoy wrote about Maria when she was 2 years old. She will be one of the riddles. She will suffer. She will seek and find nothing. Was not a metaphor. It was a description. He had understood the pattern he was creating before his children were old enough to live it. None of them were given a life that was simply their own. After Tolstoy's death at Astapovo on the 7th of November 1910, the station clock was stopped at 6:05. The room was preserved. The shadow of his recumbent head, cast by the bedside lamp against the wallpaper, was traced in pencil and preserved. Within a day, a memorial plaque appeared over the door. It is all still there. He was buried 2 days later at Yasnaya Polyana, in the birch forest, near the spot where his brother Nikolai had claimed the green stick was buried. He had requested it. There was no cross, no priest. 2,000 people attended, watched by government agents, in a silence that was described by witnesses as unlike any silence they had encountered at any funeral before. The decline I want to describe now is not Tolstoy's, it is his family's. Because what died at Astapovo was not simply a man, it was the gravitational center that had held 13 lives in orbit, however chaotically, however painfully, for decades. When it went, those lives flew outward in every direction, and the world they flew into was about to become unrecognizable. Sophia lived at Yasnaya Polyana for 9 more years after Tolstoy's death, maintaining the estate as he had left it. She wrote thousands more pages of diary. She outlived 2 of her sons. She did not outlive her grief about the final days. In the summer of 1917, the revolution that would upend her children's lives caught her at Yasnaya Polyana. The family began to starve. They had 1 cow, the servants still dressed in white gloves, the table still covered with a snow-white cloth, but the cloth was patched. Tolstoy's friends sent pasta and rice and beans when they could. The family sold their possessions. Sophia died in 1919, at the age of 75. One by one, in the years between the revolution and the 1930s, the surviving children left Russia. They could not find their places in the new order. They feared persecution. They left behind the estate, the forests, the ponds, the library of 10,500 books, the phonograph with the father's recorded voice. Alexandra was arrested 5 times and imprisoned once before she finally received permission to leave in 1929. The object that Tolstoy kept until the end, the one he would not give up even at Astapovo, the thing he had carried through the final journey, was a notebook. Makovitsky recorded it. Tolstoy wrote in it through the last days before he became too weak to hold a pen. What he wrote in those final pages was not published separately. It became part of the vast archive that Chertkov controlled. The notebook has been described. Its contents have been cited selectively. Its full text, as of this writing, is not in wide circulation. Some documents stay buried. The station master's house at Astapovo was a single-story wooden structure behind the main brick station building. The room where Tolstoy was laid was the best in the house, which is to say, it was small, simply furnished, and faced outward toward the railway tracks. The sounds of trains passed through the walls throughout the night. He arrived on the 13th of November by the old Julian calendar, the 31st of October by the calendar in use in the rest of Europe. He would die 7 days later. His temperature reached 40 degrees Celsius on the first day. By the second, he could no longer rise from the bed. Several of Russia's most distinguished physicians travelled to Astapovo. They administered morphine and camphor injections. He told them, more than once, not to bother. Outside, the platform had filled. Reporters from every major Russian newspaper were there. Correspondents from London, Paris, and Berlin. The police, who maintained their own surveillance even now. The Tolstoyans, dozens of them, who surrounded the station master's house in a loose and watchful perimeter. And Sophia, who arrived by special train, arranged by her sons, and who was told by those around the sickbed that she should not enter. She stood at the window. Someone photographed her through the glass, her face pressed to the pane, looking in. The photograph exists. She was allowed inside on the 6th of November, the day before his death, when Tolstoy had already lost consciousness. She whispered to him. It is not known whether he heard her. His last recorded words, spoken to those around him in the preceding days, were addressed not to his family, but to an idea. I advise you to remember that there are many people in the world, besides Lev Tolstoy. Some accounts record this as the final statement. Others record that he spoke his daughter Alexandra's name. The accounts do not agree, and there is no transcript that resolves them. At 6:05 on the morning of the 7th of November 1910, he died. The station master, Ivan Ozolin, stopped the clock. He had, in the days of the vigil, become a quiet figure of enormous importance. A provincial man who found himself hosting the death of the most famous person in Russia, and who made one decision that mattered above all the others. He kept the room exactly as it was, the outline of Tolstoy's shadow on the wallpaper, the bed where the head rested, the light on the pillow. He changed nothing. The clock read 6:05. It still does. Return now to the central symbolic device from the beginning of this story, the stopped clock. Time itself was arrested at Astapovo. For Tolstoy, perhaps, that was a mercy. For the family that walked away from that station and scattered in every direction, time did not stop. It accelerated. The estate dispersal that followed Tolstoy's death was not immediate. It unfolded across decades, continent by continent, as the family's diaspora expanded and the Soviet state pressed in on everything that remained. Chertkov, as executor, moved to consolidate the literary estate. He worked with the new Soviet government, after the revolution, to nationalize the Tolstoy writings, a paradox that Tolstoy himself might have appreciated in the worst possible way. And in December of 1918, the Commissariat of Education granted Chertkov a subsidy of 10 million rubles to produce a complete collected edition of Tolstoy's works. The edition took years and was never fully completed as originally planned. What Chertkov controlled, ultimately, was not just the manuscripts but the narrative. Alexandra, from her position in America, published a biography of her father titled The Tragedy of Tolstoy through Yale University Press in 1933. She published I Worked for the Soviet the following year. These were the first serious English-language accounts of what the family had experienced. They were also, by the time of their publication, the accounts of a woman who had been arrested 5 times by the state that controlled her father's legacy. Ilya died in New York, of cancer, in 1933, the same year Alexandra's book appeared. Lev died in Sweden in 1945, without reconciliation with his father's memory or his siblings in Russia. Mikhail died in Morocco in 1944. Andrei had died in 1916, of blood poisoning, before any of the revolution's chaos had fully arrived. His son, Count Ilya Tolstoy, Leo's grandson, emigrated to America in 1924 and became, remarkably, one of the founders of Marineland of Florida and President Franklin Roosevelt's personal envoy to Tibet. He died in New York in 1970. Tatiana, who had spent years trying to preserve what could be preserved at Yasnaya Polyana, died in Rome in 1950. Sergei, the most stable, died in Moscow in 1947, the last of the children to survive in Russia. Alexandra outlived them all. She died in New York on the 26th of September, 1979, at the age of 95. She had founded an organization, the Tolstoy Foundation, that sponsored more than 500,000 people to escape Soviet persecution. The great pacifist's youngest daughter had spent 50 years rescuing people from the state that had inherited his name. And here is the third and final original teaser paid off. The letter Tolstoy wrote to his aunt about Maria when she was 2 years old. The prophetic description of her suffering was only one such document. Tolstoy wrote predictive, diagnostic assessments of most of his children in their early years. Several are still found only in specialist archives. The overall pattern they describe, once assembled, reads less like fatherly observation and more like a verdict delivered in advance. He knew what he was building, or failing to build. For nearly a century after his death, the dominant account of the Tolstoy marriage was the one Chertkov had shaped. Sophia was the obstacle, the possessive, materialistic, emotionally unstable wife who refused to understand her husband's spiritual evolution. The woman who ran into the garden threatening suicide, who fired a toy pistol at a photograph, who lay in ditches with binoculars. The narrative was so established that serious literary critics repeated it as fact well into the 20th century. The document that began to change this was Alexandra Popov's biography, Sophia Tolstoy, published in 2010, exactly 100 years after Tolstoy's death, which drew on correspondence and archival materials not previously available to scholars writing in English. What Popov demonstrates, in documented detail, is that the woman who had been described as hysterical and obstructive was in fact a woman who had correctly identified at every turn what was happening to her. Sophia was not mad. She was surveilled. Her house was occupied. Her husband's most intimate thoughts were being copied and circulated without his consistent awareness or consent. The man who was doing these things had, in Makovitsky's contemporaneous description, a tremendous and despotic influence over an 80-year-old man suffering from strokes and heart disease. What history called Sophia's hysteria was, in clinical terms, a rational response to a genuinely intolerable situation. Her diary entries about opium, read in context, are not the entries of a woman planning a murder. They are the entries of a woman who was being driven out of her mind and who was, at least on one occasion, cataloguing her options. What history also failed to convey was the remarkable scope of what Sophia had actually done. She had copied War and Peace 7 times by hand. She had managed all the business affairs of the estate. She had raised 8 surviving children while producing a diary of literary and psychological depth that, in its full form, runs to thousands of pages. She had modelled, according to Tolstoy's own acknowledgement, his most memorable female characters. He had written of her boundless energy, calling it the force of life. What the press called a difficult wife, Tolstoy in his private writings called the force of life. The most heartbreaking detail that emerged from the recently accessible archival material is a small one. At Astapovo, in the final hours, when Sophia was finally allowed into the room, she whispered to her unconscious husband. What she said was not recorded by anyone present. It was not transcribed. It exists now only as a fact that she said something, that he could not respond, and that she did not know, for the remaining 9 years of her life, whether he had heard her. What the press called her madness was, in fact, the grief of a woman who had given 50 years and received, at the end, a window. Return, now, to the station master's house at Astapovo. The station clock stopped at 6:05. The outline of Tolstoy's head preserved in pencil on the wallpaper. The cot where he lay, too narrow for the size of the life it was ending. Outside, on the platform, his wife at the window, her breath fogging the glass. Behind her, a Russia that was 7 years from revolution, 30 years from the catastrophe that would scatter his children across 3 continents, 100 years from the war that would split his descendants, those still in Russia and those long gone, into factions over a prize bearing his name, administered by a government he had spent 30 years arguing was a conspiracy of violence against the poor. The green stick is still out there, somewhere in the birch forest at Yasnaya Polyana, the spot where Nikolai said it was buried, the spot where Leo asked to be buried. He is there now, in a simple grave without a cross, and the trees have grown over him, and the birches still make a sound like distant rain when the wind moves. Here is what the man built, two of the greatest novels in human history, a philosophy of non-violent resistance that reached Gandhi, which reached King, which reached a century of liberation movements, a family of 13 children who dispersed across the world, a diaspora now numbering in the hundreds, museums, foundations, digitized archives. Here is what it cost: 5 children who did not survive childhood, a daughter who sought and found nothing, exactly as predicted, a son who died of blood poisoning at 38, a marriage conducted under conditions of increasing psychological warfare for 30 of its 48 years, a wife kept from her husband's deathbed by men who disputed her claim to that room, a family that, when it finally gathered again, first in the year 2000, at a reunion Vladimir Tolstoy organized at Yasnaya Polyana, found that they had to travel from America and Sweden and Germany and Italy and France to stand in the same forest where their great ancestor had searched as a boy for a stick with the answer written on it. They did not find it either. The Tolstoy family now numbers somewhere near 400 people. They speak different languages, hold different nationalities, carry the name differently, some as Tolstoy, some as Paz, some as Cedar, some as Albertini. They are united, as they acknowledge at those gatherings, not by a shared belief or a shared language, but by a shared inheritance they did not choose and cannot put down. How does the greatest literary examination of what it means to live and die with meaning, how does it end up at a stopped clock in a stranger's room, with the wife at the window and the world watching? It ends the way it always does, when genius is mistaken for a life rather than a work. It ends in an empty house, and children who spent their whole lives leaving,